A signature can transfer millions of dollars in a second, but sometimes it carries something far heavier than money. Rain drifted across the tall windows of the Marlowe room, turning the lights of downtown Boston into soft rivers of gold. Inside, crystal glasses shimmered beneath warm chandeliers while quiet conversations floated through the air like carefully measured notes. Every table carried the scent of fresh coffee, expensive wine, and polished wood. Claire Bennett moved through the dining room with the effortless calm of someone who had learned long ago that the loudest people usually notice the least. At 27, she had served senators, celebrities, hedge fund managers, and tourists celebrating impossible dreams. They remembered the food. They rarely remembered her face. She preferred it that way. Her black apron was perfectly pressed. Her blonde hair rested in a neat knot behind her head. Her blue eyes quietly scanned every table without appearing to linger anywhere. She noticed empty water glasses before anyone asked. She noticed wedding rings that had recently disappeared from familiar hands. She noticed tired smiles hidden behind expensive watches. The quiet ones always noticed. Near the center of the restaurant, the atmosphere shifted almost invisibly as a group of executives entered together. Conversations softened. Servers straightened instinctively. Even the restaurant manager adjusted his jacket before walking forward with an eager smile. Adrian Hale had arrived. At 42, the billionaire CEO of Hale Meridian Group carried the kind of authority that never needed an introduction. His charcoal suit fit with understated precision. A silver Patek Philippe rested beneath his cuff. His expression remained calm, almost unreadable, while everyone else unconsciously adjusted themselves around him. He greeted no one with unnecessary warmth. He simply nodded once, and an entire evening reorganized itself around his presence. Claire received table 12 without comment. She carried menus toward the private dining section as naturally as if it were any other table. Adrian barely looked up while reviewing figures on his tablet. Around him, board members discussed acquisitions, market forecasts, and a regional bank scheduled to become part of Hale Meridian before sunrise. Numbers rose and disappeared with every sentence. Millions became ordinary. One executive hesitated before mentioning unexpected legal concerns surrounding archived financial records. Adrian finally looked up. His voice remained perfectly even. Delay costs confidence. Confidence costs value. Resolve it tonight. No one argued. The conversation moved forward immediately. Claire quietly poured sparkling water into crystal glasses. Adrian acknowledged her only with a brief thank you before returning to business. She answered with a polite smile and stepped away. There was nothing unusual about powerful men believing the room existed only around them. Nearly 2 hours passed beneath steady rain. Empty espresso cups gathered beside untouched dessert forks while contracts reached verbal agreement after verbal agreement. Finally, Adrian closed the leather portfolio in front of him. "Bring the check." His words were simple. Claire returned moments later carrying the black leather folder. She placed it beside him with practiced grace before stepping back. Adrian opened the folder without looking inside. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and removed a dark fountain pen whose silver trim reflected the chandelier above. The room remained occupied with quiet conversation as he signed the receipt in one smooth motion. Claire reached forward to collect the folder. Then she stopped. Not dramatically. Not loudly. The movement was so small that no one except the man seated closest to Adrian noticed. Her fingertips remained suspended above the leather cover. Her breathing slowed almost imperceptibly. Fresh ink glistened beneath the dining room lights. Her eyes never left the signature. Somewhere beyond the windows, thunder rolled softly over Boston Harbor. Claire had seen those sweeping letters before. Not once. Not twice. Hundreds of times. On birthday cards folded inside kitchen drawers. On old tax returns stacked carefully in cardboard boxes. On grocery lists written with tired hands after double shifts. On a weathered notebook that still rested inside her apartment beside a photograph she could never throw away. Her father had formed every capital H with the same subtle hesitation before pulling the final stroke downward. The ending always leaned slightly left, as though the pen itself remembered an old injury. Nobody had ever written like Thomas Bennett. Nobody. Claire slowly lifted her eyes toward Adrian Hale. The executives continued talking, unaware that the air inside the room had quietly changed. Only one person reacted. Richard Vail, the company's longtime chief financial officer, glanced toward the signature for less than a second before his spoon slipped gently against the edge of his coffee cup. The tiny metallic sound disappeared beneath the rain. Claire heard it. More importantly, she saw the expression that followed. Fear. It vanished almost instantly beneath practiced composure, but it had existed. She knew it had. Adrian noticed none of it. He closed the pen and reached for his jacket. Claire finally found her voice. It barely rose above the sound of rainfall against the glass. "Sir," Adrian looked up for the first time that evening with genuine attention. Claire's hands remained perfectly steady now. Her eyes did not accuse. They simply carried the weight of something she wished desperately were impossible. "This is my father's signature." Every conversation at the table ended before the final word reached the air. Silence settled over table 12 with a weight no amount of wealth could move. The board members looked first at Claire, then at Adrian, each waiting for someone else to explain what they had just heard. Adrian remained seated, his fingers resting lightly on the fountain pen. His expression did not change, yet something behind his gray eyes sharpened. He studied Claire with the same disciplined attention he reserved for billion-dollar negotiations. "What did you say?" he asked quietly. Claire did not repeat herself immediately. Instead, she lowered her eyes to the receipt once more, allowing the fresh ink to dry beneath the warm light. "My father signed exactly like this," she said. "Every letter. Every pause. Every final stroke." One executive forced an uneasy smile. "There are thousands of similar signatures." Claire nodded politely. "Yes, sir. Similar. Not identical." Richard Vail reached for his coffee with measured calm, although his hand tightened almost invisibly around the porcelain cup. "Miss," he interrupted with a courteous smile that never reached his eyes, "our chief executive officer has signed thousands of legal documents during his career. Coincidences happen." Claire finally looked at him instead of Adrian. It lasted only a moment, but she noticed something curious. Richard was not looking at Adrian. He was looking at the receipt. Almost as if the ink itself worried him more than the conversation. Adrian noticed Claire's shifting attention. "What is your father's name?" he asked. "Thomas Bennett." The name landed quietly between them. Adrian leaned back almost imperceptibly. Somewhere inside a place he rarely visited, an old memory stirred without becoming clear. Thomas Bennett. He had not heard that name spoken aloud in nearly 2 decades. Across the table, 2 directors exchanged uncertain glances. Richard answered before Adrian could. "Thomas Bennett worked for Hale Meridian many years ago." His voice remained smooth and practiced. "He was dismissed after a financial investigation." Claire listened without interrupting. She had heard the same sentence since she was 9 years old. Different voices. Different places. Always the same conclusion. Her father had become a story people repeated without ever asking who had written it first. Adrian slowly closed the leather check folder instead of handing it back. "You knew him?" Claire asked. "I knew his name," Adrian replied. "Nothing more." She held his gaze for another second. "I knew the man." No accusation followed. No dramatic speech. Only 4 quiet words that somehow carried more weight than everything discussed during the previous 2 hours. Rain continued tracing gentle lines across the windows overlooking the city. The restaurant seemed strangely distant now, as though every other table belonged to another evening entirely. Daniel Brooks, the restaurant manager, hurried toward the private room after noticing the unusual stillness. His professional smile appeared immediately. "Is everything all right, Mr. Hale?" Adrian answered without looking away from Claire. "Yes. We simply need a few private minutes." Daniel nodded quickly before signaling every nearby server to remain clear of the room. Within moments, the entrance stood discreetly isolated. Claire remained where she was. She did not fidget. She did not apologize. Years earlier her father had once placed a faded receipt on the kitchen table and smiled while teaching her something that had sounded strangely unimportant at the time. "People think signatures are drawings," he had said. "They are habits. Habits are harder to fake than talent." She had been 12 years old, more interested in finishing her homework than studying loops of blue ink. Thomas Bennett had laughed softly before handing her another sheet of paper. "Look beyond the letters, Claire. Watch where the hand hesitates. That is where the truth usually lives." She had never forgotten. Adrian reached toward the receipt again. This time he examined his own signature instead of dismissing it. The capital H curved naturally before the final line leaned gently to the left. Something about it felt strangely familiar, although he could not remember learning to write it that way. Richard finally broke the silence. "Mr. Hale, your next meeting begins in 40 minutes. Adrian did not respond. Instead, he asked Claire a question no one at the table expected. "How many times have you seen your father's signature?" Claire answered without hesitation. "Enough to recognize it in less than 1 second." Richard lowered his eyes. It was only for an instant, but Claire saw it again. That same flicker. Not confusion. Not disbelief. Fear. Small. Controlled. Almost invisible. Almost. Adrian Hale slowly folded the receipt and slipped it back inside the leather folder as though the paper had suddenly become more valuable than the dinner itself. Every executive at the table watched him carefully, searching his face for a reaction that never arrived. He stood without hurry, buttoned his jacket, and looked toward Daniel Brooks. "I need your private office for 10 minutes. Daniel answered almost immediately. "Of course, Mr. Hale." The manager opened the hallway leading toward the administrative offices behind the dining room. Adrian waited. Not for the executives. Not for Richard. He waited for Claire. "Miss Bennett." His voice remained calm. "Please come with me." She nodded once. There was no hesitation in her step, no visible anxiety, only the quiet confidence of someone who had already accepted that truth often became uncomfortable before it became useful. Richard rose from his chair almost instinctively. Perhaps legal counsel should be present. Adrian turned his head only slightly. "Not yet." It was not a loud answer. It did not need to be. Richard sat back down without another word, though the polite smile he wore had become noticeably thinner. The office overlooked the rain-soaked alley behind the restaurant where delivery trucks usually parked before sunrise. Framed photographs of award ceremonies lined one wall. Payroll schedules covered another. Daniel quietly closed the door behind them, leaving only Adrian and Claire inside. For several seconds neither of them spoke. Adrian placed the folded receipt on the desk between them. "Explain it." Claire looked at the signature again. "My father never taught me handwriting. He taught me observation." Adrian remained silent. "He believed signatures were living habits," she continued. "Most people notice the shape. He taught me to notice the rhythm." Adrian folded his arms. "Rhythm." Claire nodded. "Everyone pauses differently. Some people hesitate before the last name. Others press harder at the end because their wrist grows tired. My father injured his right thumb when I was little. After that, every capital letter carried a slight interruption. He could never remove it. He stopped trying. Adrian glanced down at his own signature. The interruption was there. Small. Almost invisible. Until someone knew where to look. That proves nothing, he said quietly. No, Claire answered. By itself, it proves nothing. She gently reached toward the receipt but waited until Adrian nodded before touching it. See this final line? It leans left instead of right. Adrian studied it. That happens because the pen lifts a fraction too early. My father always called it chasing balance. She smiled faintly at the memory. He said paper remembers what people forget. Adrian listened without interrupting. He could not explain why the sentence felt strangely familiar. Somewhere deep inside his memory, beyond years of boardrooms and quarterly reports, something almost recognizable stirred and disappeared before he could reach it. Where did your father work? He asked. Internal audit. At Hale Meridian? Yes. Adrian looked through the rain-covered window. The records say he manipulated company accounts. Claire did not react. The records also say he confessed. Did he? Adrian asked. No. Her answer arrived without emotion. He signed papers. That is different. The room became still again. Adrian had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions, testified before congressional committees, and defended companies during national financial crises. Yet this conversation felt strangely more difficult because the woman standing across from him was not arguing. She was simply separating facts from assumptions one sentence at a time. A soft knock interrupted the silence. Daniel opened the door only a few inches. Mr. Hale, your driver is waiting whenever you are ready. Adrian nodded without looking away from Claire. 5 more minutes. Daniel disappeared again. Adrian reached inside his jacket and removed the silver fountain pen. He rolled it slowly between his fingers. This pen belonged to my father, he said. Claire looked at it carefully. No. Adrian frowned. Excuse me. The pen, maybe. The handwriting, no. He stared at her. Claire continued carefully. People inherit watches. They inherit companies. Sometimes they even inherit mistakes. They do not inherit signatures unless someone teaches them. Adrian's fingers stopped moving. For the first time that evening, uncertainty entered his expression. Are you saying someone taught me to write my own name? Claire met his eyes without raising her voice. I think someone taught you much more than that. Outside the office, unnoticed by both of them, Richard Vale stood motionless at the far end of the hallway. His phone rested against his ear. When the call connected, he spoke only 6 quiet words before ending it. She remembers more than we expected. Richard Vale slipped his phone back into his pocket before anyone entered the hallway. His expression had already returned to the calm professionalism that had helped him survive 3 decades inside boardrooms where fortunes changed between one signature and the next. By the time Adrian stepped out of Daniel's office with Claire walking quietly beside him, Richard looked as though he had never moved at all. Mr. Hale, he said with a respectful nod, the car is ready whenever you are. Adrian looked toward the dining room instead of answering. The executives had already gathered their folders, pretending to continue casual conversation while quietly watching every movement. Wealth often attracted curiosity. Uncertainty attracted even more. Adrian turned to Claire. Are you working tomorrow evening? Daniel answered before she could. She is scheduled for the dinner shift, sir. Claire glanced toward her manager but remained silent. Adrian reached into his jacket and removed a simple business card. There was no title printed beneath his name. Only a private number embossed in silver. He placed it gently on the office desk rather than handing it directly to her. If you remember anything else about your father, call me. Claire looked at the card but made no effort to pick it up. Memory is not the problem, she replied softly. The problem is that no one wanted to hear it. Adrian held her gaze for another moment before giving a slight nod. There was no agreement between them. Only the quiet acknowledgement that the conversation had not ended. He walked back through the restaurant with the steady confidence everyone expected from him, yet his thoughts refused to return to banking acquisitions or market forecasts. Instead, they remained fixed on a single interruption inside his own signature that he had never noticed until tonight. Outside, the rain had grown heavier. His driver opened the rear door of the black sedan, but Adrian did not enter immediately. He looked down at the silver fountain pen resting in his hand. For the first time in years, he could not remember who had actually taught him to use it. Inside the restaurant, Daniel closed the office door and exhaled slowly. "Claire," he began carefully, "you understand who that man is?" She nodded. "Yes. Then you also understand how dangerous misunderstandings can become when someone like him is involved." Claire smiled politely. "Truth and misunderstanding are not the same thing." Daniel rubbed his forehead with visible concern. "Maybe not. But I cannot afford attention like this. Reporters follow people like Adrian Hale. Investors follow reporters. Restaurants disappear because of stories they never meant to become part of." Claire lowered her eyes. She understood his fear. Small businesses survived on reputation. Powerful people carried storms with them, even when they never intended to. "I am sorry," she said sincerely. Daniel shook his head. "I do not think you planned any of this." He paused before adding quietly, "But I need you to take tomorrow off while I sort this out." Claire accepted the decision without protest. She untied her apron with slow, careful movements, folded it neatly, and placed it inside her locker. Around her, the other servers whispered without trying very hard to hide it. Some believed she had impressed a billionaire. Others assumed she had made a terrible mistake. Claire ignored every rumor. She had learned years ago that people usually built stories from the smallest pieces they understood. She left through the employee entrance carrying only her handbag and a worn navy umbrella. The cool Boston air smelled of wet pavement and fresh coffee drifting from a bakery across the street. She began the 12-minute walk toward her apartment instead of calling a rideshare. Walking helped her think. Halfway down Beacon Street, her phone vibrated. The screen displayed one name. Emily. "How was work?" her younger sister asked cheerfully. Claire looked up at the rain before answering. "Different." Emily laughed softly. "That sounds like you are trying not to worry me." Claire remained quiet for a moment. "Do you remember Dad's notebook?" The laughter disappeared immediately. "Of course I do. Where did we put it after Mom passed away?" Emily answered without hesitation. "Top shelf of the hall closet. Inside the old cedar box." "Why?" Claire stopped walking beneath a street lamp where golden light reflected across the wet sidewalk. She watched the rain gather along the edge of the umbrella before speaking again. "Because tonight I met someone who writes exactly the way Dad did." On the opposite side of the city, Adrian sat alone in the back of his car. The skyline slipped silently beyond the rain-covered windows while Richard occupied the front passenger seat reviewing tomorrow's schedule. Adrian barely listened. He opened the leather folder one more time and unfolded the restaurant receipt. The signature looked exactly as it always had. Familiar. Effortless. Ordinary. Yet now he noticed something else. Just above the final stroke, there was a tiny hesitation where the ink pressed slightly deeper into the paper. A pause. Small enough that almost no one would ever see it. Small enough that someone had seen it immediately. Claire reached her apartment a few minutes after midnight. The rain had softened into a quiet mist that wrapped the old brick building in silence. She climbed the narrow staircase without turning on the hallway lights. She already knew every step that creaked beneath her shoes. Emily was waiting in the small kitchen with 2 untouched mugs of coffee growing cold beside the window. She looked up the moment Claire entered. Neither sister spoke immediately. Claire removed her damp coat, placed her umbrella beside the door, and walked straight to the hallway closet. She stretched toward the highest shelf where an old cedar box rested beneath folded blankets. Dust covered the lid, untouched for years. She carried it carefully to the dining table and slowly lifted the brass latch. Inside rested a faded leather notebook, several family photographs, and a fountain pen wrapped inside a handkerchief embroidered with the initials TB. Emily watched quietly. "You have not opened that box since Dad's funeral," she whispered. Claire nodded. "I was afraid I would only find memories." She gently lifted the notebook. The leather had softened with age, its corners worn from years of careful use. As soon as she opened the first page, the familiar handwriting greeted her. Thomas Bennet always wrote with steady confidence, every sentence perfectly measured, every number carefully aligned. Between accounting notes he had occasionally left small reminders for himself. Buy milk. Call Emily's teacher. Fix the kitchen faucet. Life and work shared the same pages without ever competing. Claire smiled sadly. He never wasted paper. Emily moved closer. "Do you really believe the man tonight learned that signature from Dad?" Claire turned several pages without answering. Then she stopped. There, in blue ink that had slightly faded over the years, Thomas had written a sentence she remembered hearing many times as a child. "A signature tells you who held the pen. Pressure tells you who held the fear." Claire traced the words lightly with her fingertips. "Dad did not teach handwriting," she said softly. "He taught patterns." Emily looked confused. Claire continued. "He believed every habit told a story. Even the smallest pause." She turned another page. Most entries contained ordinary audit notes until something unusual caught her attention. Several signatures had been drawn repeatedly across half a page, each followed by tiny observations. Angle. Pressure. Timing. Lift. They were exercises, almost lessons. Emily leaned closer. He was studying someone. Claire nodded slowly. Or teaching someone. Before either sister spoke again, a folded sheet slipped from between two pages and drifted onto the table. It looked older than the notebook itself. The edges had yellowed. One corner remained torn away. Claire carefully unfolded it. Inside was a simple practice page covered with the same name written again and again in different stages of completion. Adrian Hale. Emily stared at the page without breathing. Claire felt the room become strangely smaller. The first signatures were hesitant, uneven, almost childlike. Each line gradually improved until the final examples carried the same graceful rhythm she had seen only hours earlier inside the restaurant. At the bottom of the page Thomas had written a single note. Better today. Wrist still too stiff. Encourage confidence before speed. Claire closed her eyes. Memories she had never fully understood returned one by one. A little boy laughing somewhere beyond the kitchen doorway. Her father patiently guiding a small hand across paper. A silver watch resting beside scattered worksheets. She had been too young to understand who the visitor was. She had forgotten the face entirely. Only the sound of her father's patient voice remained. Emily finally broke the silence. "Claire, if Dad taught Adrian Hale to sign his name." Claire finished the sentence quietly. Then they knew each other far better than anyone ever admitted. Across the city, Adrian entered the library inside his townhouse instead of going upstairs. Shelves of history, finance, and law surrounded him, yet he ignored every book. He unlocked a drawer beneath his desk and removed a small wooden box that had belonged to his father. Inside rested childhood keepsakes he had not examined in years. Old report cards. A toy compass. A faded photograph. He picked up the picture and frowned. A smiling man knelt beside a young boy holding a pencil over a notebook. The man's face had faded with time, but one detail remained perfectly clear. The silver fountain pen resting inside the man's shirt pocket. Adrian turned the photograph over. On the back, written in familiar blue ink, were 5 simple words. Keep practicing, son. Proud of you. Tom. Morning arrived beneath a sky still covered by low gray clouds, and Boston seemed quieter than usual. Claire barely slept. The notebook remained open on the dining table exactly where she had left it, the page with Adrian Hale's childhood handwriting illuminated by the first pale light entering through the apartment window. Emily carefully slid the faded practice sheet into a clear document sleeve before placing it beside the notebook. If Dad kept this, she said, he wanted someone to find it one day. Claire slowly shook her head. No. Dad never believed evidence should be discovered by accident. He believed it should be understood. She reached for the fountain pen wrapped inside the old handkerchief. Unlike Adrian's polished silver pen, this one showed years of honest use. Tiny scratches covered the barrel. The cap no longer closed perfectly. Yet when Claire uncapped it, she noticed fresh blue ink still resting inside the nib. Thomas Bennett had always maintained his tools with quiet care. Emily looked toward the notebook again. There has to be more. Claire agreed. Her father never wrote lessons without leaving reasons behind them. She began turning the pages one by one, ignoring the audit figures and expense reports until something unusual interrupted the pattern. Several pages had been carefully removed. Not torn violently. Cut cleanly with a sharp blade. Whoever had taken them wanted the notebook to appear complete unless someone looked closely at the stitching along the spine. Claire gently touched the empty space. Dad did not remove these. Emily leaned closer. How do you know? Claire smiled sadly. Because he hated damaging books. The answer sounded almost too simple, yet it carried complete certainty. Thomas repaired cracked bindings instead of replacing notebooks. He taped loose pages instead of throwing them away. He would never have cut paper so precisely. Someone else had. Claire continued searching until she reached the final written page. At the bottom, beneath several accounting calculations, one sentence stood alone inside a small hand-drawn box. Never trust the first ledger. Emily frowned. First ledger. Claire looked toward the empty spaces where the missing pages should have been. If there is a first ledger, there was a second. The apartment fell silent again. Outside, traffic slowly returned to the streets below, but inside only the ticking wall clock marked the passing minutes. Claire suddenly remembered another habit her father had practiced every Sunday afternoon. He never kept important papers in obvious places. He called it protecting the truth from curious people. Her eyes drifted toward the cedar box. She lifted it again, this time examining the inside instead of the contents. Running her fingertips beneath the velvet lining, she felt something unexpectedly firm beneath the fabric. Emily watched as Claire carefully loosened one corner. Hidden underneath rested a small cream-colored envelope sealed with yellowed tape. Neither sister spoke. Claire opened it with careful hands. Inside was a single photograph and a folded receipt from nearly 20 years earlier. The photograph showed Thomas Bennett standing beside a much younger Adrian Hale outside what appeared to be Hale Meridian headquarters. Both were smiling naturally. Adrian could not have been older than 12. Thomas rested one reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. Written across the back were 7 simple words. Some promises matter more than reputations. Claire unfolded the old receipt next. It was not from a restaurant. It came from a stationery store. 2 fountain pens had been purchased that afternoon. One listed beside the note, for Tom. The other, for Adrian. Claire stared quietly at the faded ink. Across the city, Adrian arrived at Hale Meridian headquarters earlier than anyone expected. The 60-story glass tower reflected the gray morning while employees hurried through the revolving doors carrying coffee and briefcases. Richard Vale was already waiting beside the executive elevator with a folder prepared for the day's board meeting. "Good morning," Richard said warmly. Adrian accepted the folder without opening it. "I want complete access to every archived file involving Thomas Bennett." Richard hesitated for only the briefest fraction of a second before recovering his familiar smile. "Those records are nearly 20 years old." Adrian looked directly at him. "Then they have had enough time to gather dust." Richard nodded politely. "I will have compliance retrieve everything." Adrian stepped into the elevator alone. As the doors quietly closed, Richard remained standing in the lobby, his smile disappearing completely. He reached inside his jacket, removed his phone once more, and sent a message containing only 5 words. "Find the second ledger first." The executive floor remained unusually quiet as Adrian stood alone inside the archive room overlooking Boston Harbor. Dust floated through narrow beams of morning light while rows of gray filing cabinets stretched across the room like forgotten witnesses. Compliance officers moved carefully around him, opening cabinet after cabinet until one supervisor approached carrying 3 thick storage boxes. "These are all we could locate," she said. "Everything connected to Thomas Bennett." Adrian thanked her quietly and waited until the room emptied before opening the first box. Personnel evaluations. Internal memorandums. Audit summaries. Every document described Thomas as disciplined, methodical, and almost impossible to pressure. Then, almost without warning, the language changed. A single investigation appeared. Financial misconduct. Breach of fiduciary duty. Voluntary resignation. Adrian frowned. It felt less like a gradual story and more like someone had turned an entire life with one page. He noticed something else. Every report before the investigation carried Thomas Bennett's original signature. Every report after the investigation contained only photocopies. No original ink remained. Adrian closed the folder slowly. Across town, Claire and Emily spread every item from the cedar box across the dining table. The photograph, the stationery receipt, the notebook, and the envelope formed pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit together. Emily opened her laptop and searched through public corporate archives while Claire studied the practice page again. She suddenly noticed something she had overlooked the night before. Adrian's childhood signature became stronger after every attempt except one. In the middle of the page, Thomas had drawn a tiny circle around a single capital A, beside it he had written only 3 words. Too much pressure. Claire remembered hearing that phrase as a little girl. Her father had never criticized mistakes. He only reminded people that fear always left fingerprints. She carefully placed Adrian's restaurant receipt beside the practice page. The hesitation before the capital letter remained almost identical, but the pressure had changed. The adult Adrian no longer wrote like a frightened child. He wrote like someone carrying responsibility instead. Claire whispered almost to herself, "He kept the lesson, even after he forgot the teacher." Emily looked up from her computer. "Claire, you need to see this." She rotated the screen across the table. An archived newspaper article from 19 years earlier filled the display. The headline announced the sudden resignation of Thomas Bennett following an internal accounting scandal. Beneath the article appeared a photograph taken outside Hale Meridian headquarters. Reporters surrounded Thomas while another man shielded a teenage Adrian from the cameras. Claire leaned closer. "Zoom in." Emily enlarged the image. The older man's face became unmistakable. Richard Vale. Not standing beside the reporters. Standing between Adrian and Thomas. Claire stared silently. In every version of the story she had heard growing up, Richard had barely been mentioned. Yet here he was at the center of the only photograph published that day. At Hale Meridian headquarters, Adrian continued reviewing files until he reached a sealed envelope marked Executive Correspondence. Inside rested a handwritten recommendation from his late father praising Thomas Bennett's integrity. The letter ended with one sentence underlined twice. If anything ever happens to me, trust Thomas before anyone else. Adrian read the sentence again. Then a third time. The date at the top caught his attention. It had been written only 6 weeks before Thomas supposedly betrayed the company. Nothing aligned. His father would never have written such confidence about a man he suspected of dishonesty. Adrian reached immediately for the office phone. "Find Richard Vale," he instructed his assistant. "Tell him I want every original audit file from that investigation on my desk before noon." The assistant hesitated. "Mr. Vale already requested those archives early this morning." Adrian slowly lowered the receiver without speaking. Across the building, Richard stood inside his private office watching construction cranes move across the skyline. A young associate entered carrying a digital tablet. "We searched the Bennett residence years ago," the associate said quietly. "We never found another ledger." Richard remained perfectly still. "People rarely hide the truth where they live," he answered. "They hide it where they remember." The associate looked uncertain. Richard smiled faintly and closed the window blinds. "Keep watching Claire Bennett. She does not know what she has yet. The moment she discovers it, I want to know before Adrian does." At that exact moment, Claire turned another page inside her father's notebook and noticed a tiny impression pressed into the paper beneath the missing section. No ink remained, only the faint marks left by a heavy hand writing on the page that had once rested above it. She tilted the notebook toward the sunlight. Slowly, almost invisibly, one line emerged from the paper itself. It was not a financial calculation. It was an address. Claire carefully copied the address onto a blank sheet before closing the notebook. Neither she nor Emily spoke for several seconds. The words pressed into the paper seemed almost impossible to believe. The address belonged to an old records warehouse on the Boston waterfront, a building that had once stored financial archives for several companies before digital systems replaced paper. Emily searched the location online and found almost nothing except a note that the property had been scheduled for demolition months earlier but remained untouched because of an ongoing ownership dispute. Claire folded the paper and slipped it inside her coat pocket. "We should go now," Emily said. Claire looked toward the rain outside the window. "No. If someone removed those pages years ago, waiting one more hour will not change what happened." She paused before adding quietly, "But rushing could." Across the city, Adrian remained inside his office with the recommendation letter still resting on his desk. He had cancelled 2 meetings without explanation, something his executive assistant had never seen him do before. He looked again at his father's handwriting. "Trust Thomas before anyone else." The sentence refused to fit beside every story he had accepted for nearly 20 years. His phone buzzed softly. Richard Vale entered moments later carrying several folders arranged with perfect precision. "You asked for the original investigation files," Richard said. Adrian noticed one detail immediately. Every folder looked new. The paper inside appeared remarkably clean for documents supposedly stored in an archive for almost 2 decades. "These are the originals?" Adrian asked. Richard nodded without hesitation. Compliance preserved them exceptionally well. Adrian opened the first folder. Something felt wrong before he even reached the second page. The paper smelled fresh. The staples showed no trace of age. He looked up calmly. "Interesting." Richard smiled politely. "Is something unusual?" Adrian closed the folder without answering. He simply placed it aside. "Leave them here." Richard inclined his head and walked toward the door. Just before leaving, he glanced once at the recommendation letter still lying on Adrian's desk. It was a glance so brief that most people would never have noticed it. Adrian did. After the door closed, he pressed the intercom. "Ask compliance one question. Did these files come directly from storage this morning?" The answer arrived less than 3 minutes later. "No, sir. Mr. Vale collected them personally before anyone else accessed the archive. Adrian thanked the assistant and slowly removed his watch, placing it beside the recommendation letter. His father had always taken off his watch before making important decisions. He had not realized until now that he had inherited that habit as well. Meanwhile, Claire and Emily arrived at the waterfront shortly after noon. The warehouse stood alone between abandoned loading docks where gulls drifted above the harbor and the wind carried the scent of salt and old timber. The faded address matched the impression hidden inside Thomas Bennett's notebook. A heavy chain secured the front gate, but a handwritten notice announced that authorized visitors could enter through the side office. Claire knocked gently. An elderly caretaker opened the door after several moments. His eyes narrowed with quiet curiosity. "Can I help you?" Claire removed the photograph of Thomas from her bag. "Did you ever know this man?" The caretaker adjusted his glasses. His expression changed almost immediately. "Thomas Bennett." He spoke the name without uncertainty. "He came here every few months." Claire felt her heartbeat quicken. "Do you remember why?" The old man smiled faintly. "He rented a private records locker. Said some papers should never belong to a corporation." Emily and Claire exchanged a silent glance. The caretaker disappeared briefly into a back room before returning with a worn ledger book used to track rental units. He turned several fragile pages and stopped beside an entry dated 19 years earlier. Locker 47. Tenant: Thomas Bennett. Status: active. Claire looked up in surprise. "Active?" The caretaker nodded. "The rental has never been cancelled. Every year someone pays the storage fee in cash before the deadline." Claire's voice barely rose above a whisper. "Who?" The caretaker slowly closed the ledger. "I have never known his name." He paused before adding one final sentence. "But he always signs the receipt with the initials RV." The caretaker reached beneath the counter and removed an old brass key attached to a weathered leather tag stamped with the number 47. He did not hand it to Claire immediately. Instead, he studied Thomas Bennett's photograph one more time before speaking with quiet certainty. "Your father always said that if the right person ever came asking, they would already know why this locker mattered." Claire accepted the key with both hands. It felt unexpectedly heavy, not because of the metal, but because of everything it represented. The caretaker led Claire and Emily through a narrow hallway lined with aging steel doors until they stopped in front of a locker that had remained untouched for almost 2 decades. Claire slid the key into the lock. It turned smoothly, as though someone had carefully maintained it all these years. Inside rested only 3 objects. A thick black ledger. A sealed envelope bearing Adrian Hale's name in Thomas Bennett's handwriting. And a small cassette recorder. Nothing more. Nothing less. Claire carefully lifted the envelope first. The paper had yellowed with time, but the seal remained unbroken. She looked at Adrian's name for several silent seconds before placing it back inside the locker. "This belongs to him," she whispered. Emily nodded. "Then do not open it." Claire reached for the ledger next. Unlike the notebooks she remembered from childhood, this one carried no company logo. Every page had been written entirely by Thomas Bennett himself. Dates. Transactions. Cross-references. Personal observations. But what immediately caught Claire's attention was a column that appeared again and again beside certain entries. Verification completed by Richard Vale. She slowly turned more pages until one paragraph stopped her completely. Thomas had written, "If these records are ever found, remember this before judging Adrian." He never knew. He was still a boy learning to carry a name that many adults wanted to control. "Protect him from the lie before you restore mine." Claire closed her eyes. For 19 years she had imagined confronting the man whose company had destroyed her father's reputation. Yet her father had never written a single sentence asking for revenge. Every page pointed toward truth instead. Back at Hale Meridian headquarters, Adrian stood before the panoramic windows of the executive conference room while the afternoon board meeting unfolded behind him. Financial projections filled the presentation screen, but he heard almost none of it. His attention remained fixed on the recommendation letter inside his briefcase. Midway through the meeting, his assistant quietly approached and placed a handwritten note beside him. It contained only one sentence. Compliance confirms there are no original signed investigation files in company archives. Adrian looked toward Richard, who continued presenting quarterly numbers with perfect confidence. For the first time in his career, Adrian realized the man he had trusted for decades might know exactly why those files no longer existed. He calmly closed the presentation folder. "We will continue this meeting tomorrow," he said. Several directors looked surprised. Richard paused in the middle of a sentence. "Tomorrow?" Adrian nodded. "Some numbers deserve another review." No one questioned the decision. After the board members left, Richard remained behind. "Is something wrong?" Adrian answered with unusual calm. "I am beginning to think I have been asking the wrong questions for 19 years. Richard smiled politely, but the silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. At the waterfront warehouse, Claire pressed the play button on the cassette recorder. Static filled the small room before a familiar voice emerged, softer than memory but unmistakably her father's. "If you are hearing this, then the truth has survived longer than I expected. Claire, if it is you, I am sorry you had to carry my name before you could understand it. Adrian, if you are standing beside her, then you finally found the courage to question the story instead of protecting it. Listen carefully. A signature can be copied. A document can disappear. A reputation can be stolen. But character always leaves evidence somewhere. Do not waste your lives proving who was wrong. Spend them protecting what is right." The recording ended with nothing more than the quiet sound of a fountain pen being placed on a wooden desk. Claire wiped away a single tear before gently returning the recorder to the locker. She looked toward the sealed envelope addressed to Adrian and understood that some truths could not be delivered by strangers. They had to be placed into the hands of the people who had lived inside the lie. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. Sunlight broke through the clouds and reflected across the harbor, turning the gray water into scattered ribbons of gold. Claire locked the locker once more and slipped the brass key into her pocket. She was no longer searching for a lost father. She was carrying forward the integrity he had protected until his final day. Somewhere across the city, Adrian looked down at his own signature resting on a document waiting for approval. For the first time in his life, he set the pen aside instead of writing his name. The quiet ones are never truly ordinary.